Welcome to Monocle on Fashion, a show on Monocle Radio offering exclusive insights and global perspectives on the fashion industry. I'm your host, Natalie Theodosi. On today's show, we look at the crossover between fashion and costume design as Monocle on Fashion's producer, Lily Austin, speaks to Lisy Christl, the Oscar and Bafta-nominated costume designer of the film Conclave. Lily joins me here in the studio to tell us more about her conversation with Christl. Lily, welcome back on this side of the room.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
I think you've picked a very topical issue to talk about because there's so many conversations in the fashion industry about this increasing crossover of fashion design, costume design, and I think a lot of fashion designers have been very curious and they've been wanting to work on film, starting with one of our favorites, Jonathan Anderson. Why do you think this is happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a new thing, right? Givenchy was known for collaborating with Audrey Hepburn on Funny Face and Breakfast at Tiffany's. I think throughout film history, there's always been collaboration, but it seems like this year in particular, there's been a lot of crossover. Jonathan Anderson collaborating with Luca Guadagnino on 2 films this year, Challenges and Queer. And also Pedro Almodovar, his film The Room Next Door featured, it was a very high fashion film with designers like Bottega Veneta and Celine.
That was one of my favorites, even looking at the stills, right? Those pops of color.
Exactly.
There's Tilda Swinton, Julianne Moore, so they wear the fashion so well. And I think it's interesting because now there's so many rules about how fashion is styled and presented. Brands don't want to be next to each other if they belong to a competitive group. But I think on film, those parameters don't really exist anymore. So you can pair things a little bit more freely. I think it was interesting. Jonathan Anderson did a lot of research with and worked with vintage dealers and stores to address the characters on Queer and Challengers with a lot of vintage. And hearing him talk about the projects as well, it was interesting because it felt like it was freeing for him to once not be responsible of an entire collection and just work on Luca's brief and be kind of part of a project rather than the leader, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's something about working on film versus collections. When you're designing a collection, you're thinking about your customer, but they're your customer. Whereas in film, you're thinking about the character and their psychology and bringing that to life, which is something Lisy Christl talked about in our interview, how that was something she was really drawn to in costume design. And Jonathan Anderson has said the same thing, that it's a different challenge for a designer to think about the personal character and dressing them. And I think on the flip side, as the viewer watching that, it's amazing to see clothes actually being worn, seeing Tilda Swinton telling the story of a character and wearing those clothes is a very different thing to seeing it as on the runway. It really brings them to life. And I think it's a great way to sell clothes.
Absolutely. I think when it's done well, almost the fashion becomes a character of its own in these films. And you might not be able to buy that specific outfit. There's not a direct sell-through for the brands to track, but it's still kind of, I think, increases desirability and builds kind of the overall image of the brand, which is extremely valuable.
Definitely. And I think on the other side as well, the last few years has been difficult for the fashion industry, but also for film. Film is struggling with the rise of streaming services. And so I think it makes sense that there's this kind of an increased cross-pollination between designers and filmmakers to try and help each other amplify what they're doing.
100%. And I think you raise a really interesting point there because that collaboration is reaching a completely new level in the last year or so because people like Jonathan Anderson are going into costume design, but there's another layer where fashion brands are building their own production studios and producing films that have nothing to do with their collections. They're just financing directors and filmmakers that they like. You might see some of the clothes in the film, but it's more about funding film, which I think is really interesting, especially the case of Saint Laurent Productions, which already produced Emilia Perez, which is a controversial movie, but nominated for so many awards. And it will be really interesting to see how they keep it going. What do you think of this kind of marriage of the two industries?
Well, I mean, it definitely makes for great films because, yes, Emilia Perez is a bit controversial, but there's no denying that the clothing, the costume design is impeccable. And a big part of that was that they had access to Saint Laurent's archive because of this production. And I think, and similarly with Conclave, you know, this is a film about the Vatican and the choosing of a pope. You know, we've always known that there's a real crossover between the Catholic Church and fashion, high fashion. Designers have been inspired by it for a long time. And as Lisy Christl mentions in our conversation, you know, the Met did an exhibition about this a few years ago. And you really see that in the film, the crossover. It's a very chic, high fashion film, and cinema is made to have that kind of quality of costume. You know, it really works.
Incredible. Let's hear directly from Lisy Christl.
You know, I'm born and raised in a Catholic part of Germany, and I thought I know a lot about this world, but I didn't. So I read a lot. I did quite a profound research. And for a long time, I couldn't allow myself to, I didn't even think to change the whole look. Very quickly, we knew we're going to change the color, we're going to change the fabric. But to make an interpretation of the actual clergy world came at a later point. And what I said previously, I love costume, I love storytelling, but I also love design, and I also love fashion design. And I think we all share all these wonderful designers from this year's Academy Awards or BAFTAs. I met all of them and we get along very well. But there is just a philosophy, and I think this is the interesting part. And my philosophy is study profoundly. Next step, try to find your interpretation with your taste and in the world we live in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw a mood board for Conclave, and it included images of Balenciaga's 2020 menswear collection. So I was really interested in that kind of incorporation of contemporary design and, you know, in this case, the vestments of the clergy. Where does that come from, and how do you go about weaving these things together?
You know, as long as there is this feeling, homework done, good girl, it's not good. It's not good. Then I saw the couture shows from Balenciaga 2022, and I thought, this is interesting. This, you know, it was just so like an enlightenment. Is this the proper word? And then I started to read about Cristobal Balenciaga. I mean, you know, we know now it's Demna Gvasalia who is the designer, but there is a real Cristobal Balenciaga. I read about him, and he was so incredibly modern in his lifetime. But he was also a really faithful Catholic. He went to church every day. He was an altar boy, and I thought, look at this, you know, how this is inspiration. So, you know, the road back led me to this new road, and Demna Gvasalia lived for quite a while in Berlin in the most interesting days in the whole club scene, etc. So what you meet there is Cristobal Balenciaga meets Berghain, Berlin, shake it up. And so I think, this is interesting for me because we shot in Rome today, in our days. It's a contemporary movie, even if it seems strange, but this is a contemporary movie. And I wanted to, whatever I do, I try to approach it with the utmost respect and without prejudice. And I think they look more beautiful than the real ones. So,
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a bit about that as well. What was the decision behind? You mentioned changing the colors and the fabrics slightly. What
And
was
the
that?
cut
And the cut. So what was your reason behind that?
it's an easy research, the Conclave 2013. And you see how these old men enter the Sistine Chapel. And I thought, it's really difficult for me as a visual artist to take this serious, everything. And then being in Rome, and you are surrounded by the clergy world. So, yeah, my approach was to give them a respectful and beautiful attire.
Before we started recording, you mentioned that you do period design, but you also bring it together with the contemporary. And it just struck me that Conclave is kind of the perfect film for you in that case, because, as you said, this is clothing that has been worn for hundreds of years and is very traditional, but very much set in the contemporary. And I'm thinking about the eyewear that the cast wore in the film that's very modern, and the fact that they're holding mobile phones in many of the scenes. What is the appeal for you of bringing together, when you're working on a period film or something that has a traditional sense to it, and bringing it into the contemporary? What is it that appeals to you about bringing those things together?
I need a connection to the garment, whatever it is. Whether it's 16th century or it's 2024, I need a connection. And we all have our very personal taste. And this taste has to touch the costume. I have to find, not myself, but yes, in a way, myself. I'm feeding myself with so much information and research, and somehow it's really like a journey in this, for Conclave in the world of the Vatican. But I did 16th century London, and so you become part of this world, but it's still me living in our days and having my personal taste. And I would say I'm more a minimalist than a maximalist. I love very much clean lines. So, for example, the lace part of the choir dress was the first thing I thought, no, we have to get rid of this. It has to be a really, really clean line. But I'm very respectful with the truth, and I have to know the truth. And when I know the truth, and I know why I lose things or why I add on things, I'm fine.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you'd worked with Edward Berger before. You worked on All Quiet on the Western Front with him just a couple of years ago, in fact. I'm guessing you went straight from one film to the other because they're only a couple of years apart in filming.
We literally left Prague, and 2 weeks later we went to Rome. But then the movie got postponed for, I would say, 10 months. And this gave me this luxurious moment of having the time of this extensive research. And of course, we had an art historian who worked with us, professor for liturgy and philosophy. But first, you have to do your homework, and then you can ask somebody.
Mm. And how did it compare working on All Quiet on the Western Front, of course, a film set during World War One? I mean, I see some connection there. You're working in both instances on films where essentially the cast are wearing the same kind of, all wearing the same kind of uniform, whether it's vestments or the army. But how did those two experiences compare?
The philosophy of a uniform is a uniform should hide the individual, but still there is an individual behind. And all these individuals are coming from different social backgrounds, different parts of the world. So you can't forget this. And I love to find, the little space in between to give some informations about the person, some ideas about his personality or his upbringing. What was actually easier on All Quiet. But, more or less I stick to the truth, more or less on All Quiet. And on Conclave, it was a proper design job.
Well, I wanted to talk a bit more broadly about your career. You worked on your first film when you were 31, is that right?
Yeah.
What led you to it? Was this always what you knew you wanted to do?
Yeah, there was a moment I thought, maybe fashion is also interesting. And then I found out I need a real story. I cannot think in collections and in spring, summer, autumn, winter. I can only think in stories, in human beings, in their life. I love to study social backgrounds. I love to study centuries. I made my master tailor. I was in a theater in Munich, where I come from. And, by this time I knew all this existed. My dream, it was always my dream when I was a child. I never played with dolls, but I directed little plays and dressed my characters. But I just didn't know what I do. And then I learned what I do and how happy it makes me to read, and at the same time these people are walking through my brain, and it's difficult to explain. I learn it better and better to talk about what I do. But I think as a costume designer you might have a different look in the world or on people. And after my theater experience, I went into this movie world, and the first assistant director from a director I worked with as a costume assistant, he was the first assistant from Michael Haneke. And he talked about me with him, and I said, but you are aware I'm an assistant, I can't show anything. Yeah, but he still wanted to meet me, and he gave me this first chance when I was 31. And since then, I do what I do.
And I wanted to ask you about Michael Haneke, because his style is contemporary and almost a kind of stark realism, I guess, which does contrast a lot with some of the other films you've worked on. What was the experience of working with him, and is that different in any way to working on period films?
I would say with Michael, the interpretation is a really different path. For example, he wouldn't like if you make a drawing for a costume. It's all based on picture research, extensive picture research, and then, huge mood boards, creating worlds. We had always something like a production Bible where we had a very strict style. And, like every director, but Haneke has a very specific separation between life in a city and life in the countryside. And you have to learn all this. And we were also, I worked for 10 years with him. And the whole crew around me worked for 10 years with him. And we had long and extensive discussions about everything, really about everything. And for example, for Cachet, I was for weeks in Paris on the streets with my camera, doing pictures from school kids, from just people, women, men from a certain society. I went with his assistant to the banlieue from Paris and with a video camera, and we recorded families from North Africa. So, it was almost like a documentary. It was a documentary, actually, what we did. And all this material was a very important part about the whole look from Cachet. So I did this for 10 years and I enjoyed it very much. But today, many years later, I would say, yes, I still work like this, but on a certain point, I shift into another world level interpretation.
And so when you say another world level interpretation, do you feel like you're bringing more of your own eye and interpretation to it?
Yeah. I have so much more experience now, and it's all about experience, really. So it's interesting when you start your career and you have this fresh eye and you know a little bit, but not that much. And now I know much more. I would say maybe I have another confidence in me, but I have still the sleepless nights. I'm still very all over the place when I read a new script. But I have like a different archive in my head. Yeah, let's call it a different archive. Yeah.
I was going to say probably all those years of taking pictures and observing is now, you've now got that, so you can kind of take that with you when you're working on a new project.
Yes, exactly.
You know, it's funny because whenever you meet a stylist, so often they have some kind of background in psychology. You know, they did it at university or something. And there does seem to be, I mean, I guess it's not that surprising, but there is something in how what we wear, it's not just about having taste or style or being fashionable. It is just a expression of your personality.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, when I went in Los Angeles to the Costume Designers Guild Award, I never in my life saw so many costume designers in one space. And it's so interesting how different we are, all of us. And this would be a fantastic book, you know, all of us, with our CV, with our upbringing. Yeah, I think it would be interesting.
Mm. Speaking of books, you mentioned as well that you're working on a book currently. Can you tell us a bit about that?
You know, this will be a long time project. I'm on it since about 3 years. And it's about religion and clothes. And the idea was born long before Conclave, long before. And yes, I'm working on it. I showed it the first time 2 weeks ago to an editor. And it will take another 2 years, but it's about, first volume, the Christian world, about the meaning of each habit and also the status quo. What is still alive? How all these sisters, brothers, bishops, priests, what do they wear? What is the meaning? What is their upbringing? Where do they come from? So I do interviews and I work with a photographer, and yes, it's a fantastic journey. So whenever I'm not on a movie, I spend a lot of time in Rome working on this.
Wow. And do you think that comes as well from your own upbringing, your Catholic background?
Maybe, this. I'm sure there is another journey behind, and there's a reason why I start with my own world. But in an ideal world, I would love to continue with, next volume, Jewish religion, next volume, Islam, next volume, Hinduism, Buddhism. It's something what really fulfills me, and it combines what I do for my living and what I love, but I own it, it's mine.
But what is it that there's obviously so much, I can imagine there is so much to discover about, and there is so much to write about the clothing of different religions, but what is it for you that interests you about that?
I find it very inspiring, really inspiring, and during the research for Conclave, and thinking about how many great designers in our days are inspired by this world. The early collection of, the couple who designs Chilsander. Now it's different, but the first collections, it was like in a cathedral, and the dresses were like very stylish nun habits, or Dolce & Gabbana, Versace. You can clearly see all these women and men are coming from pretty straightforward Catholic upbringings. There was this beautiful exhibition in New York, Heavenly Bodies.
Yes, at the Met.
Yes. So, it's a part of us. And I did a movie in India years ago, and I traveled a lot in India. It's one of my soul countries. And I think with the first journey in India, I could say, yes, it's a visual paradise for me, but I can clearly see I have different roots. I have not only a different upbringing, but these roots, they belong to religion. Whether you are faithful or not, but there is something what is simply part of our education, whether in our families or in school. And, we will see where I'm going to end with this journey, but it's an inspiration, and I'm also interested in all these people I meet on my journey. And you wear this habit or this type of clothes, and you show to the world what you live and what is your faith and what is your opinion. And I find this really, really bold, and in our days, even bolder.
Well, it's amazing that you worked on Conclave, because it seems like this is the perfect combination of all these things that you're passionate about. Yeah. So it's wonderful that this is the film that you're getting so many kind of acknowledgements for.
Yeah. I'm very happy about it, obviously.
That was Lisy Christl, the award-winning costume designer of Conclave. And that's all for today's show. Make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for more big interviews and exclusive insights into the world of fashion. Today's episode was produced and edited by Lily Austin. To contact the Monocle on Fashion team, email Lily at lja@monocle.com. I'm Natalie Theodosi. Thank you for listening.